to indicate that this lecture will be recorded, streamed and podcast. Video recordings will only capture the speaker, and attendees will not be visible. Your voice, however, may be captured if you ask a question. If you do not wish your voice to be captured, please speak to me in advance of getting started so we can determine an alternative means for you to participate. Or feel free to write down a question and pass it to me, and I can read it out for you. Now, our presentation today is the fifth in our B2A Brown Bag series. Again, B2A is the Overcoming Barriers to Information Access program that has been funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services. It is supporting 6 of our doctoral students to complete their PhD program and to investigate topics that relate to different aspects of how barriers to information access may be overcome. Our presenter today is the 5th in our series for this academic year, is Jeanette Glover, who is a B2A fellow, and she will be talking to us today about issues related to African American materials and LCSH. Jeanette.
Hello, good morning, afternoon. The title of my presentation is Access Denied, and that's the question because it may not be an intentional denial of access, so I want to leave it open-ended, well, in the best way I can. So this is an exploratory study of Library of Congress subject headings for African American materials. In presentation outline, I'm going to go through my background, like why am I doing this, why am I interested in this, and then I'll go through the research project, go through the overview background. I'm doing the background of Library of Congress, classification and subject headings, and the history of Library of Congress subject headings for African American materials, my methodology, results, conclusions, my limitations, and further study. My background. I started working as a cataloger as a student, and even as a student I had a lot of questions about why certain things were the way they were. And this is not just subject headings, this was everything in general, from the whole cataloging process. And I know the questions, and as I moved forward in my career as a cataloger, I started training other students to do the same thing that I was doing. And they had the exact same questions that I had. Like, why are we assigning this subject heading to this book or this material? Like, why are we doing it this way? And the answer across the board was always, that's just the way we've always done it. So we had to accept it as true. And then as I came over to studies again, started reading the literature, and I started seeing, okay, this area has been explored, people have asked these questions before, and things have been done to help improve the situation. And then finally, I'm curious. I'm a naturally curious person, and I started doing my own research on the job in my own time, just looking up certain books that I was interested in reading. Then I look at the subject headings, and I would think, if I did a search for this book, would it occur to me to use this particular heading to find this material if I didn't know the title or what it was about, what it was about? So that propelled me to doing this research. Okay, now research project. This research was a study and analysis of the current status of Library of Congress subject headings for African American materials. And I wanted to examine and address cultural bias in LCHH for this area, as is shown in the terminology used to describe the materials for this group. I wanted to be a historical perspective. I wanted to go back and analyze and evaluate the challenges that have arisen in the past. And I wanted to see what changes have been made, why the changes have been made, and is there still a problem with the issue? Is there still a problem with subject headings for this group of people?
but could you define for me African American materials?
African American materials are books by or and about people of African American descent. Yeah, and they use African American and Black interchangeably. Black, they use Black.
But it's
or-
authors and
Yeah.
content.
Yeah. Okay. And the Library of Congress subject headings have traditionally been criticized for biased headings that include things that are gender specific and culturally relevant. And it hasn't traditionally adequately represented marginalized groups. And other issues with Library of Congress subject headings have been, they are strict policies regarding changing terms for subject areas. They've also used terms, they use terms not written in natural language, so it's difficult for some users to find materials. And the assumption is that they use terms that are for the majority, but the Library of Congress subject headings classification represents the Eurocentric male Christian orientations of the originators of the system, as well as the time period they're constructed. So this is a problem. And then there's also a problem with the inadequacy of subject analysis done. In 1951, the chief of the Library of Congress subject cataloging division laid the operating principles, and he said the heading should be that which the reader will seek in the catalog if we know or can predict or presume what the reader will look under. And the Library of Congress also follows the principle of literary warrant when deciding to establish a heading. And I'll just discuss literary warrant, so for those who do not know what it means. And I thought this was really interesting. And I don't like to read, but I'll read the bolded part, so you don't have to worry about trying to read it. It says, the number and specificity of subject headings included are determined by the nature and scope of the Library of Congress collections. Subject headings are established as they are needed to catalog the materials being added to the collection or to establish links among existing headings. And in recent years, they started collaborating with other libraries based on the needs of the collections, as they need headings that the Library of Congress may not have materials on those subject areas. And then I also thought it was interesting to point out that when to establish a new heading, and it says establish a new heading for a topic that represents a discrete, identifiable concept when it's first encountered in a work being cataloged, rather than after several works of the topic have been published and cataloged. But this also can lead to issues if you only have one work. And the concept of literary warrant applies to both the classification and subject headings. So, what is a literary warrant? In LIS, the term means that an indexer or classifier has to provide adequate ground for the indexing, classifying, as well as definition of indexing terms and classes in classification systems in the literature. And warrant is also the justification for the inclusion of a term or class that controls vocabulary, as well as its definition in relations to other terms. And NISO 1994 defines warrant as words and phrases drawn from the literature of the field should determine the formulation of descriptors when two or more variants have literary warrant. They use the most frequently used term as a descriptor. So that's literary warrant. Please let me know if it's still not clear. Okay, so now the background on subject headings for African American materials. And as early as 1940, it was recognized that there was a need for expanded vocabulary for African American materials. So her name is Frances Jocum. She compiled a list of all the headings for books by and about Black people And then the Library of Congress subject headings were later incorporated that list into their heading list. And then no further concern was shown in the literature about these materials until 1970, when Amy Doherty published an article in Black Studies. I guess in the 1970s was when Black Studies became more popular, and so all the issues popped up again. And so in 1975, Doris Clack, her book Black Literature Resources Analysis and Organization, she attempted to deal with access to resources for Blacks from a practical standpoint. So she attempted to identify and relate subject headings that were relevant to shelf location. And then following her research in this area, the Library of Congress improved its subject headings to allow for ethnic aspects for certain relevant subjects. Continuing, and then again in 1994, Clack revisited some of these issues and found that subject headings listed in library LCHH attempt to describe the African American experience, and it continued to draw widespread discussion from librarians and users. And these concerns were exacerbated by the variability of language used in African American resources, so they weren't consistent at that time. So our study in 1990 found that a lot of librarians thought that problems still exist with the structure, but this was around the time when the online catalog was becoming popular. So they thought the problems would be solved by the oncoming online catalog, which would resolve most of the problems. They thought it would solve most of the problems associated with retrieving these resources. And so this leads me to the beginning of my study. In 1995, Lorraine Brown published a work that anticipated a few major changes in LCHSH, and two changes in particular were noted, and they were based on the principle of current usage at the time, and still relevant today, in literary warrant. And the major change that was supposed to happen was the use of African American for Afro American. And that right there is an issue within itself, and I will describe more of that later. So this is the book that Lorraine Brown published in 1995. It was a part of her dissertation, I believe. So what I did, part of my methodology, I wanted to constitute a sample of LCHH for African American materials and evaluate for any bias. So there are about 5,000 subject headings in this book. And to make it fair, I wanted to take a random sample. So I chose 100 headings, and I had to create a pair of random numbers. So I had one number for the page number of the book, and one number for location on the page. And to do this, we went to a page that had the longest amount. So this was a trial and error. It took a lot of time to go back and forth and to find numbers that matched up. So this was the most time-consuming part of the project. And for each heading, I looked at the headings as they existed in LCHH before the book was published in 1995, and I also analyzed any changes that were made after 1995. So to evaluate it for further bias, I examined how the headings were formed to arrive at tangible rules to make the evaluation process clearer. And what I did, I used Clack's guidelines. She has 3 guidelines to determine how adequately and efficiently African American materials can be found. And the first one is terms of relevance to African American and Black experience in the United States. The second one is the capacity for specificity. And then the third is the predictability of the structure of terms used as the vocabulary of the system. combination of her, she has 7 levels of relevance, and I also combine that with Olson's marginalization and differentiation to evaluate for further bias. And the 7 levels are just arranged in terms of relevancy. Level 1 is the most relevant to African Americans, their culture, and or experiences in the United States. And level 7 is the most general and broad as it relates to African Americans and their experiences in the United States. So our results, out of all the 100 headings that I searched in LC authorities, only 10 were changed and 1 did not exist. So we had 89 headings that remained unchanged. And these are just examples of some of the headings that were changed. Social work with the socially handicapped was the term as it was in 1995, and it is currently social work with people with social disabilities. And the same with libraries. They changed historically Black colleges and universities to African American universities and colleges, which is interesting to me because they are called HBCUs, and I just don't imagine anyone searching for HBCUs under that specific term. Some of these were terms that, for like Emancipation Day, this is not a holiday in the U.S., but they changed it to specify the specific countries that do celebrate this holiday. Then they have Apollo Theater. They changed it to be more specific at where it is in New York. I don't know if it's because there's another Apollo Theater that I don't know about in New York, but I just kind of interesting. And the Black business enterprises, they just switched the words around and put Black at the end of it. And then the one that doesn't exist is the United Negro College Fund institutions. And I'm thinking that it could be that this term is used, because there's a term for United Negro College Fund, so I guess that might be the same term, and they didn't feel the need to keep this heading in the list. So, yeah, that's interesting. Continue on, for a more quantitative perspective, I divided up the types of changes as shown here. So, based on what I showed before, 45% of the changes were related to the form of name changes in LC authorities. But there were some names, like personal names, that were changed, but I didn't include those in that list. And then 18% were changed related to the change in headings for disabilities, which were the top 2. Another 18% were related to consistency issues, and then the last 9% was a defunct heading, which possibly did not exist, and we don't know if it's covered by another heading. And I'll talk more about that in my limitations, because that is a limitation of my study. So 89% of the headings that I sampled remain unchanged after 16 years after the publication of Brown's book. I found to be interesting. So my conclusions on this is I tried to formulate this study as a quantitative analysis of LCHH for African American resources. And this is the first known one. A lot of the literature on African American resources were published. I think the last one was published in the late 90s. Was it the Clack article from 1994? The other resources that I got to help me with my research were from the 2000s, but it wasn't specific to African American material. So I could say many improvements have been made in LCHH in regards to the terminology that they use to describe these materials, but LCHH still does not keep up with the societal changes and the need for terms that are relevant to society as it is today. And there are still problems, but they are just not as prevalent, or people choose not to focus on those problems as much as they did in the past because there are strides being made. And they still use literary warrant as a basis to establishing new headings. So, my limitations. Okay, this is, LC Authorities does not keep extensive notes about when subject headings are changed, why they're changed, or even notes about what previous headings have been. This was a great limitation to me because I took these headings out of Lorraine Brown's book, but I had no way of knowing that those headings actually existed in Library of Congress before that time, or if they created them because this book was published. Which leads me to, she anticipated that these changes would be made in the 1996 edition of the LC subject headings list. But these headings, even the change from Afro-American to African-American, was not made until late 2000. So the changes came 4 years after her book, 4 or 5 years after her book was published. It was published in 1995, anticipating the changes would be made in 96. None of the changes were made until 2000. And if I had a better idea, because going to LC Authorities, they don't have dates, but since I can read the authority records, I can see when it was last updated. But if they updated it in 2000, I still have no idea of knowing when it was created, what the previous heading was, or rationale why they were changed. I had to make assumptions and judge why the changes were made myself, which I would prefer not to have done. I'd prefer to have, so having LCHH not be clear in why changes were made was a great limitation for me, and not knowing if Brown actually got the headings from the authorities list or she created these herself was also an issue. And there's not a lot of literature in this subject area, so a lot of this I had to take from other studies being done about other areas, cultural areas, to get an idea of where I should go. Which leads me to future study. The sample size calculation suggests that there's a generalizable 95% confidence, plus or minus 6%, which means that if I had a bigger sample size, it would have been generalizable at 95% with a plus or minus 5 confidence, which means there is room for further study, which means that the stability of the list reflects that this is reality and it's not a result of change, which means that I need to do more study. I need to do more research in this area. So future study would be actually doing a sample of 150 headings, new pairs of random numbers, doing the whole thing over again, and seeing what kind of results I get by doing this over. And by doing this research the first time, I now know the mistakes I may have made along the way and how to resolve any problems or issues that arose with this first study. And these are my works cited. Thank you.
I find it fascinating that they don't keep records of how the authority records have changed. They don't keep that detail and stuff. I understand the literary warrant. I'm curious though, like when you say they updated an LCSH, like when they went from Afro-Americans and they changed that, does that get globally applied to things from the past too that had the heading Afro-Americans?
Yes, but each library has to do it individually.
Okay.
They put out a subject heading list change. The libraries import those changes, and they have to globally change them.
Okay, I remember doing that when I was at Golda that one year.
Yes.
But I also wonder then how that affects the retrieval of certain resources that, like if somebody is looking for something that deals with a specific concept that was referred to in a specific way in a specific point in time, they kind of lose that nuanced thing if they can't see what the old might have been. I mean, especially for academics, you know, if you wanna look back and find some, you're actually researching and you want materials that dealt with outdated terms. Kinda, sort of. Do you know what I'm saying?
I think I get what you're saying a little bit.
Isn't that still kept in the catalog? Like, an old search term would say, see such and such. new."
Only if it still exists. They do
Oh.
use old headings, and that's the issue that I ran into. So
So
I
the-
can't, unless I get if I go back and check out from the library or anyone that kept the old subject heading books, then I might be able to go back and find and see if they existed back then. But other than doing that, I don't.
So there's that inconsistency there, you really can't dig.
Isn't there a place in the MARC record that says where a heading came from?
Yeah, there is a bump there is a MARC book to keep the whole history of the headings, where this heading come from, but unfortunately, they don't really keep the whole record, like how
Yeah,
has
okay.
really changed.
Yeah.
So
So
maybe
Okay.
if you can get the physical, hard copy of subject headings in the past, you
Yeah.
may, can track, but nowadays, we use the online subject headings, so it's, classification web doesn't really helpful.
that's what I think I have to do after actually the physical work. And it's a lot of work.
Are these changes in terms also coinciding with changes made by other government agencies?
I think it's very possible, because they held on to the antiquated terms for so long. I'm thinking, I definitely know that the disabilities subject headings would change because there was a push to change the way people with disabilities were reflected in the catalog. They found the previous terms offensive, so they definitely had to change that based, because that was around the time where a lot of legislation was happening with people with disabilities. So it does also coincide with that. Yes.
Sorry, I called you Denise. When I was a doctoral student, one of my classmates is named Denise Glover. She's also African American. Every time I see your name, I think, you know, when I'm looking at Jeanette. But I have a comment from my history. When I was at NLM in the 80s, just for a year, they were dealing with this issue, but they have two sets of terms for race. One is social and one is medical. I mean, it's just physical. They ignored the social one because it created too many problems and just made their brains hurt. So they made consistent headings for the medical terms. And they've since addressed the social terms. But can you give me a little more detail about your sample and why it took so long to come up with the 100? And is there a way you can?
Okay, I should have gotten the book, because it would be easier to explain that way. Some pages were, so in order to make sure that we accounted for all the possible headings that could be on the page, we chose the page with the most headings. So the second number that denotated the place on the page, so we got a page that only had like 5 headings on the page. If it said like 16, then I couldn't use that number and had to regenerate another number. So that was the issue that I encountered. Some pages had up to 25 headings on a page. Some had as little as 5, which is an issue within itself, the way the book is structured.
So if you continue your work in this area, you just
I just
have to do it.
Definitely.
Have you ever thought of doing a random number sample, like using your computer? So you would type in how many pages are on, in your book, randomly have that generate the number, and then randomly put in a number for however many, so then you could just go through, and, I mean, that would be a better sample than.
Oh, I didn't do the book. I actually did an Excel. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But that took long as well because I wanted to try to get all the ones that actually measured up first. Then I had to recalculate, but if the numbers kept coming out short from the page, then I had to start over. And so it still took a long time, even though I used Excel to generate the random numbers. Go ahead.
I still couldn't really understand that whole, sampling,
Oh.
random sampling process, but my question is, why does it matter? I feel like this is more qualitative study,
Yes.
So I think even though you just pick some headings on purpose, like purposive sampling, it doesn't, hurt in this study. I don't know, my question is why you, select the headings randomly instead of, just pick more controversial headings.
I think I thought that it would make it less biased on my part, because I didn't want to come back to me and say, oh, you just picked the headings that you wanted to see if they changed. That would have been nice, but I think it's less biased if I actually just generate the random numbers. That way I had no control over what headings came out in my results.
For those like controversial ones, like you mentioned, it might be fun to do something like a Joe Tennis's ontogeny, the life of a subject
yes.
over time and see how it's changed and where. And the other thing that he did that was kind of cool that relates is he made a study through WorldCat of how many libraries actually changed it, where they were. But his were more things that changed from place to place, whereas this one probably wouldn't place, it'd be more of the terminology, I would
Yes.
think. But it'd be fun to play around with for sure.
I agree. I think there are libraries that still think it's too tedious to change the headings. So I know there are libraries out there that still have the antiquated terms. It's just a matter of finding them. Bigger institutions like UWM, it took them a while to do it, but they globally changed all of them. So I guess I have to go on a fact-finding mission to find places that I could play around with and do that kind of research on.
Maybe you could clump pages, like a 25-page section and then do it within that section, the next 25-page section.
That'd be a good idea. Let's try that.
Can you talk a little bit more about the bias test and what you found? I mean, I don't think I completely understand what it means if they're biased. Does that mean that if they were changed, then there was bias? Let me think about how I'm phrasing my question. Can you talk a little bit more about your results from the bias test?
Okay, yeah. Excuse me. So the headings that were changed, they didn't all have to do with bias, but because there were some that were changed due to consistency issues, it was really difficult for me to actually run the test because there weren't a lot that were changed, which for me, I was disappointed. I thought perhaps there would be more headings there that I could examine. So because there weren't many, that's when I went through, and so when I did this table right here, this is kind of when I ran it, because so form name and then the disabilities, that was kind of like antiquated, like the former headings. So I didn't have the results that I thought I would to adequately run the test that I wanted to, because the headings really didn't apply.
Actually, it's interesting because you just mentioned that you're not letting change, that's why the number is very small, to analyze the reasons for not change. I was curious also to look at the ones not changed. Whether they are still might fall into a category of change, but they're not changed they change in one place but not change in another place. Or why they didn't change. So that might be another thing to look at the other side of the story, to see is there any patterns are actually there too. So that's another thing to take a look. I just don't know whether they're adding, is that the same reason you thinking that might be there actually applied, or there's other things used as a criterion too.
Okay.
Because that would be, the ones that are remain unchanged would be a more accurate depiction of what she considers bias, you
Okay,
know?
yeah.
Because she's calling it bias, so.
That actually makes sense. I don't know why I didn't think about that before. But thanks for the idea that if I run this again, then if I have, hopefully I don't get the same results. Hopefully it would be with a bigger sample, I would have more to work with. And then I'd be able to run those tests on the unchanged headings, which would be interesting to see. I wish I had done that now.
Do you know if this rate of change is fairly typical for LCSH? Is that pretty well across the board, that it's very slow in doing this, or would you say that this is,
It's difficult.
it is typical, so
I think
regardless
they-
of the topic area, so if we're looking at other groups or
I
where
didn't,
there's potential for bias, then
they might be slower. 'Cause I think there was a heading that, and I forget what it is, but they recently changed, but for the longest it was.
Cookery.
Cookery.
Yes.
Cookery.
They finally changed that after, I don't know how long. And, because I know people were, that you can suggest headings change, but we don't really know how it works.
They make you enter your credentials
Yeah.
and make sure that you know what you're doing before you suggest it, and you have to list all the book, and it's like a pretty laborious process, I would say, for a, a random person. So in some ways, it almost assumes that you have a library background to even be making the suggestions. I just looked at it at the LCSH homepage, or the LC homepage one time, and it was kind of
My
surprising.
question is whether they're doing, I assume they're doing batch change instead of doing one by one change, because that will be harder for them to send out any new changes there too. So considering all the, library has to do all the work, it's not something you keep saying, oh, every 3 days, let's change something. So it does take time.
And I know, I understand why they wait before they change certain headings, because they want to make sure that this sticks. Especially with the African American, Afro-American, the terminology for Black Americans changed so much. They want to make sure that this term will actually stick. I heard this somewhere, but I think they wanted to make sure it would stick because between the 70s and early 2000s, like, things kept changing. They kept coming up with new names. And politically, it kept changing. So I think 2000 for them was good enough to be like, okay, this might actually stay, so we don't have to change so often.
maybe this is where social media could be taken advantage of, where you could get the efforts of groups of people who can then pool their knowledge and skills, and that might help to enact change more quickly.
You could look at African American materials on places like Library Thing, where there's social tagging, and see if there's more tags for African American or Black or whatever it might be, you know, just as a comparison.
Yeah, one of the problems I find with LCHH is that Black is used for people Black that are not in the United States. So if someone mistakenly thinks, oh, I'm looking at Black, they won't find what they're looking for because they're not living in the U.S. So that's what initially drew me to it, because a lot of the times I've like from HBCU to African American colleges and universities, which most of them are HBCUs, so I didn't understand that change in particular. I just thought it was interesting to see.
Well, yeah, I mean, white South African, you know, like for example, Dean, or Provost Britz is African American, you know?
So,
Any additional questions? Well, thanks very much, Jeanette. We have one more presentation this semester. Next month, Gina Jago will be talking to us about some of the work that she's been looking at addressing relevance to it. Hope to see you there. Thanks very much.